I want to share it. Let me share it.
Here we see Moti is entering the meeting.
Here we are. We are live on YouTube.
Here we see Moti.
I have to silence that. Okay, one more go live, and then you can start, Buzz.
Okay.
Wait. All right. We're good to go.
Okay, everybody. It's a pleasure to have you all here and on the streaming at Yaron page. We are delighted to host Yaron for another meeting of Zoom to Freedom, which is a special project that we started during this Zoom days, and we are running it from Israel, New York, and Puerto Rico, and I'll let Tal Heinrich from New York take the lead and introduce Yaron. So thank you, everybody, and welcome.
I don't think a lot of people. Why don't you introduce Tal?
Well, okay. So Tal Heinrich from New York is a media personality. She's a member of the Israeli Freedom Movement. She's working in New York and assisting our online events, especially the international one, and we are glad to have her. Please, Tal, take the lead.
All right. And her father is one of the founders of the Israeli Freedom Movement. I think we should mention it too.
Yeah, and he's proud to be here among our visitors during this Zoom meeting, I think.
Who knows where I would be if not for her father and what he organized in Israel way back when. I guess I would have met Boaz somehow, but it would have evolved in a completely different way. So thank you, Moti.
That's really flattering, everyone. All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome. As you heard, I'm Tal Heinrich here in New York, Israeli journalist, news anchor, and nowadays also a contributor for Quick Hits. It's a new media initiative of me and my colleagues. And I'll be hosting this conversation on behalf of the Israeli Freedom Movement and the Ayn Rand Center in Israel. Our guest for today, Yaron Brook, the host of the Yaron Brook Show podcast and the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. He's joining us from Puerto Rico to discuss where we are on the scale of controlling a pandemic and being controlled by a pandemic, by fears, by restrictions. I would just like to mention that if you have questions, you're very welcome to submit them. You can do it in Hebrew. We have many listeners, many viewers in Israel today, but also in English. You can send it here in the chat or directly to Boaz on the WhatsApp, and he will send it to me. So Yaron, very good to see you again, as always.
Yes.
I think it was about a month ago when we had a pretty similar conversation, and we talked about how governments around the world are struggling with shaping policy based on inaccurate and incomplete data. Now, unfortunately, not much has changed over the course of the last month. What have we managed to learn, though, during this time?
I mean, unfortunately, not that much, because I think that there's still massive gaps in the way governments have responded to this. And we're still very much constrained in our actions, constrained in our ability to move freely and to work, to actually go to work and produce for a living. But the one constraint is just data. We really don't still, and it's shocking, but at least in the United States, we still do not have data. We don't yet completely understand who is getting sick, how many people are getting sick, who's getting coronavirus, how many people in the population are infected, which is a key metric, is how many people actually have this. How deadly is it? Nobody knows. I mean, we can all estimate, we can all guess, you can all use your best statistical knowledge. And, I have an opinion about how deadly I think this is, but it's not, we don't have a definitive universal answer. We also don't understand why it's so bad in New York and not so bad elsewhere in the US, why it was horrific in Italy, France, UK, and not so bad in other parts of Europe. So Belgium was particularly badly hit. It really is, there's still a lot we don't know. And a lot of it has to do, again, with I think a failure of a governments to respond. And I hate to say that because I hate to, I don't think government should do that much. So, but in this case, given government's involvement in our lives and our economy, there's nobody else to do it, right? If we had private healthcare, if healthcare was completely privatized, if insurance was completely privatized, then other entities within our societies would be responsible for getting this data and getting information and getting knowledge. But right now, we have no option but to rely on government to provide us with all this. And they failed us. They very much failed us.
So some states in the United States, countries like Israel, the UK, Germany, are gradually moving towards fully reopening their economies. Some countries, by the way, like Germany and South Korea, I saw, are facing new outbreaks now after starting to reopening the economy. And these are two countries, by the way, that we all hailed as great examples of how to handle a pandemic. Now they have new troubles to handle there. Do you think that we started moving towards reopening economies based on a real substantial reduction of the virus or the threat of the virus, or is it more driven by our ability to tolerate the situation?
Well, I don't believe we ever should have been locked down, right? So I believe that the lockdown should have been isolated and short term. I certainly think that given the massive failures, again, of government in New York, Blasio and Cuomo, the complete and utter failure throughout February and March to test, to create an infrastructure for testing and isolating and tracking, that maybe in New York you had no choice. By the time of middle of March, you had no choice but to lock things down. But most of the country never needed to be locked down. I think most of the world didn't need to be locked down. And again, I think the best example is still South Korea. The fact is that even with the outbreak, the new outbreaks in South Korea, and they're unavoidable, the virus is not going to just go away. That South Korea still has the right model. It's about as close to as good. The only other country I know that's as good as Taiwan, and to some extent Singapore. These countries have a model that basically says we're going to test a lot of people. And then if we find a positive, we're going to isolate that person. And then we're going to track who that person interacted with. We're going to test those people and isolate anybody who tests positive. And if you do that effectively, that's how you contain a pandemic. That is, every expert in the field says the same thing. This is the way to do it. And what the government needs to do, because this is the role of government, particularly in the world in which we don't really have freedom and no other entity can do this, is they need to very quickly leverage the infrastructure, create an infrastructure to execute on test, track, isolate. And South Korea did this, Taiwan did this, Singapore did this. All of those countries have very low death rates. They have very low caseloads. And yes, you're going to see spikes, like Singapore just saw a spike because some people came in from out of the country and brought it. You remember, South Korea has no travel bans. People are still traveling in and out of South Korea. So yes, the virus is going to come back again. But the fact is that if you continue to then test, track, and isolate, you'll continue to contain it. So first, we should have never shut down. It was a massive mistake. And the argument to come back with is, but more people would have died. Yes, more people would have died. You know, people die. People die of disease all the time. This is a particularly deadly disease, but it's not so deadly. So that you would have to shut down all of society. If they had done the proper thing, then you wouldn't have had to shut down the economy. Now, in terms of opening up now, this is the mind-boggling thing about it, right? Okay, so they screwed up in February, and they screwed up in March, and they didn't do the testing. Okay, we're now in May. Actually, time goes in a weird way when you're stuck at home, but we're already in the middle of May. So they've had February, March, April, half of May, 3.5 months, and yet they're still not testing, right? So they're using that as an excuse not to open. So I have given up on the idea that the U.S. government can test, track, open the economy up. The fact that they're incompetent idiots, the fact that they have no plan, and when they have a plan, they can't execute on the plan, is no excuse to keep me at home and to limit my freedom. And I should choose whether I want to go outside, who I want to interact with, whether I want to wear a mask, how far I should interact with it, how far I should be with other people, and let other people make decisions about that. And if I get too close, they can walk away. So the point is, let's put it on individuals to be responsible. The only country that did this, but they did it in a screwed up way, is Sweden, right? Sweden has no lockdowns. It has it's up to people. Most people stay at home, but they can go out if they want to go out. It's up to them. But Sweden made the mistake that I think everybody's making a mistake. They didn't test. And as a consequence of not testing, they have more deaths than they should have. But the death rate in Sweden is not such, even in Sweden, that you would have to say, well, we need to shut down the world. We need to shut down people's lives.
I think in Sweden, it's about 6 times higher than Denmark right now. I guess. Like, look,
one of the reasons you lock down is to flatten the curve. Everybody's heard about flatten the curve. The area under the curve is the same. The area under the curve is the number of deaths. The difference is that when you flatten the curve, you spread out deaths over a long period of time. And the reason you do that is not to overload your hospital system. Sweden didn't flatten the curve. So they're getting a lot of deaths early. Denmark will have more deaths over a longer period of time. In 2 years, when we look back, I'm going to guess here that Sweden and Denmark will have very similar death rates.
So I want to stop you here because many people are asking, is it too soon to tell which strategy has proven to be better? Because people are trying to make interim assessments. Is it the right way to go? Can we even make interim assessments?
No, and that's the point. The point is that when you don't know, there's only one way to err, and that's on the side of liberty. It's on the side of not intervening in people's life. This is the way I approach it. If the government knows that there's a terrorist about to attack your neighborhood, they can shut down the neighborhood. But if they just know there's a terrorist in the vicinity somewhere roaming, then they can't shut down stuff. So for the government to limit your freedom, to limit your liberty in a particular context, they have to have real knowledge that there is a real threat to you. The less the government knows, the less they can act. So the fact that we don't know which strategy works best, in quotes, because I don't know what best means. It depends if you're trying to minimize deaths. I'm not trying to minimize deaths. You can minimize deaths. That's a ridiculous goal, right? The less you know about that, so Sweden's model is the best model unless we have clear information that this is going to be, 30% of the population going to die, or some grave consequences going to befall society. But the fact is that not only, people are dying and more people than usual, and maybe double the regular death rate. Okay. But most of those people are people who are very old. Now, not to say that people who are very old, their life doesn't matter, but they're very old and most of them are sick. So they've got a life expectancy maybe of 2, 3, 5 years. So they're dying earlier. So that's sad and tragic and not good. But it's not the end of the world either. It's not the same as if this virus was hitting children. Right? Then I think the conversations would be completely different.
Yaron, we keep hearing this phrase, the new normal. Every time when I ask people, I get different answers. Some people are big believers in this new normal, a new world that will shape once we're out of this pandemic. And others tell me, no way, there's no new normal. Life will just go back to normal as we know normal. Where do you fall?
I think to some extent there will be a new normal, and certainly it'll take a while. If we go back to normal, it'll take a while to get there. There are a lot of people who are afraid, and one of the great damage that has been done with this pandemic is how much fear mongering has been committed. Again, if you're under 60 years old and you're in good health, you're not. The probability of you dying from this is not worth considering. It's just too negligible to change your behavior, but everybody is panicked. Everybody's hysterical. Everybody thinks they're gonna get this and they're gonna die. I've told my wife several times, I just hope I get it already and get it over with. Right? The whole thing is maybe I've gotten it already. I traveled so much, before they locked everything down. I wouldn't be surprised if I had it at some point. So I think people will change their behavior because they're so afraid. So I think irrationally so. And look, certain things are going to change. So for example, restaurants, by law, restaurants are going to only be able to bring in half the capacity for a long time, I think, until we have a vaccine. That means prices go up. That means fewer people can afford restaurants. That means some restaurants close, and when we go to restaurants, they're going to be empty, and it's going to be harder for them to make a living. Airlines, I mean, I have no idea what's going to happen to airlines, and I have a vested interest because I've got millions of airline miles and hotel points and all that stuff.
I thought you were about to say I have millions invested in airline shares.
No, I have millions invested in, well, other people's money invested in other stocks that have done pathetic. So I'm in bad shape, but no, it's airlines. What are they going to do? I mean, it's going to take. I do think the new normal is people going to fly less. I think real estate. There's a real question about real estate. There's a real question about. Look how wonderful Zoom works. Look how wonderful these kind of meetings are. I think more and more people are discovering that they don't necessarily have to do face-to-face meeting. I think we're going to shift to much more virtual meetings and things like that. So I do think there are going to be some changes in the margin, but 3 years from now, I think most things will be back to normal. Certainly once we have a vaccine, nobody's going to remember this. It's going to be gone. And the next pandemic will be there, the risk of it, but nobody will give a damn. So until a vaccine, we'll have a new normal. Once the vaccine is here, I think certain industries will have to adjust, and then we'll have this normal that'll look a little different, but also very much the same as the old normal.
So as we're gradually starting to go back to some sort of routine, open businesses in the US, the US Congress already passed trillions of dollars to individuals, families, businesses, entire industries to compensate for the loss of income and jobs. President Trump, by the way, he said that all those jobs lost will be back. What should we and the president keep in mind if we want to recover from this economic crisis as rapidly as possible, if we want to bring back those jobs or different ones?
Well, to some extent, it's too late because they've already printed $3+ trillion. And the economic consequence of them just printing that money can't be taken back. It's a consequence. They shut down the economy. You can't get back the wealth that was destroyed. You can't get back the life savings of people who invested in a small business that's gone. You can't get that back. You can't get the emotional damage that has been done to people because they have lost their businesses or lost some of their savings. So there's no way to bring it back, and jobs won't just come back. I don't think this will be a V recovery. Now, if you wanted to make it smoother, if you wanted to come out of this healthy, if you wanted to come out of this, then it's simple. It's what we should have done, I don't know, 50 years ago, 40 years ago, 30 years ago, yesterday, tomorrow. I'll be having the same conversation with you in 10 years. It's pretty liberate the economy. That is, deregulate everything, get rid of government regulations, get rid of all the burdensome taxes or simplify taxes and flatten them and make them really, really easy. In other words, eliminate the burdens on businessmen and entrepreneurs and on job creators and on wealth creators. Make it as easy as possible for people to start businesses and to prosper doing businesses. The economy is not driven by consumption. This is one of the most pernicious, nonsensical ideas that exist in the world in which we live, that economists keep repeating over and over again. It's become kind of a truth in people's minds. You can't consume anything unless you grow it, until you produce something, and therefore have the money from the production to go and produce, to go and consume. And you can't consume anything until somebody has produced it. So for every act of consumption, there are at least 2 acts of production. And it just, everybody wants to give people money so that they can go consume. Consume what? When nobody is working, when nobody is making stuff. Elon Musk said the other day, he said it in a really funny way, because he said, I just have to tell people, all the ignorant people out there, to have stuff, somebody has to produce stuff. Stuff doesn't come out of thin air. It's not.
They're not letting Elon Musk produce in the Alameda County right now in California. Why won't you weigh in on this? I just saw that he reopened the plant.
You're right.
Yeah.
I
And he's thinking of moving the headquarters of Tesla now to either Nevada or Texas.
all the bad things I've said about Elon Musk all these years, and I'm sure I'll say again, I take back, because just this one act, it redeems him, in my view, of a lot of really bad stuff he's done in his life. He's standing up to the California government. He's saying, I want to produce, leave me alone. My employees are here voluntarily, leave them alone. We want to create stuff. Go away. It's none of your business. And it's none of their business. It's none of their business. You know, the people, again, the people susceptible to this disease are people over the age of 70, let's say. Isolate them, protect them. Most of them are in old age homes. They're not on the assembly line of Tesla. And if somebody lives with somebody who's 70 years old, then that person should take care not to go outside and infect that person. But the assembly line workers in Tesla, even if they get sick, are unlikely to suffer horrific consequences of the fact that they get sick. So government, leave us alone, get off our backs. And so I commend Elon Musk for doing that. It's sad that he's doing it for a subsidized car, right? A car that couldn't exist if not for government favors and subsidies and all kinds of breaks. And of course, a car that runs on coal, right? A friend of mine, Alex Epstein, calls the Tesla the coal car, because how do you get electricity? You burn coal. So this idea that electricity is clean is bizarre, because the only way to get electricity is by burning fossil fuels. So it's a fossil fuel car, just like any other car. It just has an intermediary called a battery. That's all. Right.
All right, Senator Chuck Schumer, I don't know if you saw, but he said last week, we need bold action on the economy. We need Franklin Rooseveltian type action, and we hope to take that in the House and Senate in a very big and bold way. How do you tackle that?
The $3 trillion is not bold enough, I guess. 3 trillion. People don't, people, they don't care about trillions. It doesn't matter. Okay, so a little bit of history, right? Mm-hmm. FDR came into office in January 1933. Unemployment was, I can't remember the exact number, let's say it was 16%, 17%. In 1938, 5 years later, anybody know what unemployment was? Exactly the same as it was when he came in. Mm-hmm. The United States was still in a Great Depression when World War II broke out. It was still in a Great Depression when Pearl Harbor happened, and it was still in a Great Depression when we won World War II. FDR did nothing to get us out of Great Depression. Indeed, most rational economists believe that what FDR did was keep the United States in a depression, sustain the depression, make it worse. So with all due respect, and I don't have any really, to Chuck Schumer, the last thing in the world we need is another FDR. The last thing in the world we need is more government spending. The last thing in the world that we need is more government infrastructure or government projects. What we need is to liberate producers, which was not done during the Great Depression. What we need is, again, deregulate, cut all the subsidies. I'd like to see the government spend less, cut government spending, tell the Federal Reserve to lay off buying every risky asset out there and distorting the entire system of prices in the world so that we don't even know what assets are worth. Let's move towards liberty, towards freedom, towards capitalism. Capitalism is the only system in human history to produce wealth, the only system in human history to bring people out of poverty. You want to solve any economic problem. The solution is always less government, less interference, and to free up the entrepreneurial, productive spirits of the people.
How do you explain to people that governments don't have money? People just don't get the concept. They say governments, they have a lot of money. You have the security budget. They can take it from here, move it there. They have a lot of money.
First, they don't take it from anywhere. So I wish, right? I wish we cut something and we spend it over. No, they just borrow more money. And of course, who are they borrowing from right now? They're not borrowing from the Chinese. They're not borrowing from the Japanese. They're not borrowing even from the American people. They're borrowing from the Federal Reserve. How does the Federal Reserve, a central bank, how does the Federal Reserve have money to lend to the government? It prints it. It creates it out of thin air. So the sense that that paper stuff that we call dollars is money is part of the delusion here, right? It's not really money. It should be what money has always represented in the past is a real asset, something of value to people. But the paper has no value. The paper just facilitates transactions. Now, you'd think the paper is really backed by assets, by something, but it's not. It's just, and therefore when the Fed prints it, then it's creating what used to be called inflation. And that inflation doesn't necessarily manifest itself in higher prices. It manifests itself in higher asset prices, so it doesn't get reflected in price inflation, but it gets reflected in distortions in the economy. But to your question, every dollar that the government gets, it gets from one of two sources. Either it's stolen it from me or you or somebody else who happens to pay taxes to the United States government. So I don't pay any taxes to Washington, D.C., so they don't get any of my money. But so they either are taxing it, so it's your money that they're using, or they're taking on debt. How are they going to pay back the debt? By taxing your children and your grandchildren. Or there's a third option, they're printing it. But inflation is always a tax. When they print new money, in one way or another, they are devaluing the money that you have in your wallet. They're making it less worth because they're making more of it. So any way you look at it, what government is doing is taking money from you and allocating to what they think is best. And central planning doesn't work, has never worked, cannot work.
But then you have people around the world saying, Yaron, in 2008, we had huge bailouts and money printing following the financial crisis, and that never caused inflation, not one that we can see. So why not writing the same cure, the same prescription again to the disease, you know?
As Frederick Bastiat, I think, said in the 19th century, it's been around for a long time. It's not the seen that what matters, it's the unseen. And economics, to a large extent, is the study of the unseen. It's a study of the consequence. So yes, they printed money like crazy. Yes, they did all, and we didn't get price inflation, but we did get slow economic growth. How much has Europe or the United States grown in terms of GDP growth since the Great Recession? Almost nothing. We got asset inflation. We've gotten stock markets through the roof. We've gotten bond markets through the roof, so much so that interest rates are zero. We've got inflation in other ways. And what that inflation does is it distorts the investments. It distorts where money goes to, which suppresses economic growth. So the stagnation that we've experienced over the last 10 years, and Japan, by the way, has experienced over the last 30 years, is all a consequence of this idea that they can print money to get out of problems, that they can somehow create wealth out of thin air. And it's wrong, and it's perverse, and it's massively distortive. People invested in the wrong things, produced the wrong jobs. And as we go from crisis to crisis to crisis, this will only get worse. So I am projecting, so between 2008 and today, the economies of the West have grown between 0 to 2%. The best economies like the United States have grown between 1 to 2%. The worst economies have grown between 0 and 1. Japan has been at 0 and 1 for 30 years. I expect that as we move into the next 10 years, the global economy, the global developed economy, the developed world will grow from 0 to 1%. That's it. So 2% will be like super growth because we are basically instituting stagnation throughout the West. And every time we go through a crisis and respond in this way, we make it worse. I wouldn't be surprised if many economies go to zero, negative growth, and we start really starting to see wealth shrink in parts of the world. It is super depressing. Not so much for me, but for my kids, for the younger people around here. It is really depressing because the world is going to get worse from an economic perspective and from a liberty perspective, because they almost always go together. There's no way, all these economic mistakes, you have to pay a price for them. There's just no way out of that. There's no free lunches in the world. You can't print $3 trillion and expect everything to return to normal and everything is going to be fine and we're going to grow at 3-4%. Ain't happening. And of course, who knows what's going to happen in the US election now and what kind of, where we go here in terms of economic policy. But there's nobody out there who has even a semi-rational economic policy moving forward.
Boaz.
Okay, we'll open the microphone for audience question. And Danny, I see that you raise your hand, so I unmute you. And if it's still relevant, please go ahead, introduce yourself. Okay, and start with introducing yourself. So,
okay. If I ask in Hebrew, you can. I will translate and answer the question.
I'll start off and ask in English, though. I'm Danny Hirschtal. I live near Haifa.
Native language, so that's not a big challenge. Go ahead, Danny.
Okay.
To start off, we'll ask in English because I want to ask an important question. So one thing that you mentioned was that one of from the more liberal perspective that pretty much all of us agree with, that the goal would be to tell those who have a problem to immunocompromised or very old people to take care of themselves and let everyone else go about their business. Is that equivalent to saying that I have a gun and it's legal to own a gun and it should be legal for me to own a gun, and if I shoot out my window and there's a park, then people should know not to go to that park because they might be hit by a bullet I shot out the window. When we're talking about going around in the public space, you're saying somebody might have a heart condition or AIDS or something. They shouldn't be allowed in the public space because your ability to walk in the public space carrying coronavirus might kill me.
No, so I'm not saying that. First of all, I don't think we should force them to stay home and not walk in the public space if they choose to take that risk. But what I am saying is,
well, would you go to a park if there was a guy who lived in a building?
I don't think it's equivalent, and let me tell you why. Right? I do think it is the government's job, if I'm shooting my gun out the window, to take my gun away from me. And if there's any suggestion that I might shoot, if there's a real suggestion, I posted on Twitter that I'm going to shoot my gun out the window, then they should take the gun away from me, right? So if I pose a risk to others, but it's an objective risk, I know that you're posing a risk to others, then it should be taken away from them. The solution is the Korean solution. We should be testing everywhere. And if you have coronavirus, then the government has every right to lock you up. Now, I don't think it has to, right? It can tell you to self-isolate, and most people will. But it has the right to lock you up, right? If you have AIDS and you're not telling anybody you're having unprotected sex with people, then you're a criminal. You're a criminal, right? That's the shooting out the window, right? You have it. So step number one has to be massive amount of testing so that we can tell who's a threat and who's not a threat. Then the people who are threats, isolate them. Now, in the case of there are some people who don't know, we haven't tested them yet, then we don't know. Then, then be careful. Then everybody should be careful, right? And yeah, if I mean, I can't use your analogy because it doesn't quite work, but, so first, if we take out the people we know have it, and then we tell people who are sick and are 75 years or older, be careful, because if you get it, it's really deadly. And they can be careful. Then the risk that's remaining is very small. It's very small. And people will have to manage that risk. And again, the more you test and the more you make testing easily available to people, the less risk there is. That make sense?
Boaz, do we have another question from the audience?
Okay.
Someone who wants to speak, or should I take it away? You're muted.
Danny, you might want to.
Yeah, well, first of all, raise your hand or send a message if you like to ask. I'll ask Oz if you like to ask the question he suggested when we talked before the event.
Okay.
So Oz, if you up to it, I can open your mic.
And Danny had another question, right?
Danny, another one. One moment. Danny, you're unmuted now.
Got it on chat. I can just read it from the chat.
Right? Okay.
That's fine. Go ahead.
He says, did South Korea violate a lot of privacy right with their plan as well? And maybe they did. I don't know the specific details of South Korea, but I don't believe you have to violate privacy rights. First, you have the coronavirus. You are a potential violator of rights. And as such, I think the government has every right, and people around you have every right to know who you interacted with. And taking your phone and figuring out where you were is not a violation of your rights. Then anonymously texting all those people to say, hey, you might have hung out with Danny and Danny turns out to have COVID. Come and get tested is not a violation of anybody's rights in my view. So I think there are ways to do this. And look, if you're going to violate rights, and I'm not for violating rights, but if you're going to violate rights, I think it's a much smaller violation, the privacy issue, than it is to shut everybody down in their homes for weeks on top of weeks. Now, I'm not advocating, because I don't think it is a violation of rights, but if I had to choose between the two, I take to hell with privacy, for a few weeks, and I'm not going to lock myself at home. And I could be fined for $5,000 for jogging in the street right now.
Well, I read that in South Korea, the latest outbreak right now, they have 29 new cases out of the 35 new cases are related to a bar district, a nightclub district in Seoul, which is very popular with the LGBTQ community. And now there's a backlash against this community in the country, but they are tracking people. They tested 2,500 people and they have 3,000 more to track and test. I want to ask you something about rent freeze and rent control, because we keep hearing these voices in New York, and also they have these protests now in California. In California, I saw that in New York, there will be a final vote in June on the matter. They're considering controlling rent for about 1 million rent-regulated apartments in the city. This bill just passed in a preliminary vote, and there will be another one in June. I want to ask you for your thoughts about such measures. Why is it dangerous?
There are very few topics in economics that are being studied more than the effects of rent control. And there is not a single sane economist in the world, and I emphasize sane because a lot of them are nuts, that believes that rent control benefits anybody. It is an unmitigated disaster. So let's say you rent a place and you rent it for $500, when in the market it should have been $1,000. First of all, the owner is making no money. They can't invest in the building. They can't improve the apartment. You're not going to invest in the apartment because you're renting. So to hell with that. You don't care. You're going to stay there forever. There's a huge incentive for you not to move because you get locked in this amazing rent. I know people who have rent-controlled apartments. They never leave, which is psychologically in all kinds of ways hampering for you. It's just what it creates is a drastic deterioration in the quality of housing. And then there's another thing that happens. Landlords have no incentive to come and fix the plumbing or fix the electricity when it goes out. Indeed, the opposite. They want you out of there. They want you to leave because when you get a new renter, you can jack up the rent, right? So they want as much turnover as possible because the turnover allows them to jack the rent up. So the relationship between landlord and the person in the apartment is completely screwed up. And it's a lose-lose. Everybody loses. Your apartment deteriorates. Nobody takes care of it, but you can't give it up because the rent is so cheap. And it's just now that's just economics. It's a massive violation of individual rights or property rights It's none of the government's business how much we decide that you should pay me for the apartment you're renting. That's a decision the two of us can make. There's a marketplace. It's not like one side is even ignorant and one side is really knowledgeable. There's no even information asymmetry here. There's a complete marketplace. Government should just stay out of voluntary trades between individuals. So I think this is a disaster for New York. It's one more ways in which New York City is going to become less attractive as a place to live. I think that they've been trying for years and years and years to make New York as unattractive as possible. This might be it, that where actually people start en masse leaving New York City.
I have a question here submitted directly to me. The reason for the, I'm translating it from Hebrew, or should I say it in Hebrew? I don't know. The reason for the existence of a state is an organized defense on individual liberties facing enemies.
Yes.
For example, just outside or foreign enemies. Do you consider a pandemic to be, an outside enemy, and in the name of the war against it, is it legitimate to restrict individual liberties, or is there some line that you shouldn't cross?
The answer is yes, but it's complicated. And this is why a lot of thought has to go into it, and why when you look around the world, nobody is giving it any thought, which is so shocking. So what a proper government would have is they would have a law that says, this is what we do when there's a pandemic. First of all, they would define pandemic. They would say a pandemic is when XYZ happens, this amount of mortality, this amount of risk, because the common cold theoretically is a pandemic. The flu is theoretically a pandemic. Lots of infectious diseases that we just accept, are technically pandemics. But you want a clear definition based on the level of risk that is involved, and that's not simple. And different countries might have different definitions. That's why I'm not for one world government. It's nice to have competition between countries. Then, what are the powers that the Congress can delegate to the executive branch when such an occurrence happens? So what can the government actually do? Can they lock everybody at home? I doubt it, right? I doubt that's ever right. But so first you would have to have a whole set of laws that delimited and defined the enemy, right? What the enemy really is. Then when a pandemic hits, so I'll take the US system of government, but it's equivalent to what would happen in Israel. I think the Congress would have to go into session. It would have to declare an emergency, declare pandemic, just like it's supposed to declare wars, but we know they haven't declared a war since World War II. But they're supposed to declare a war, right? Then give the executive special powers, and those powers should be framed within the context of the nature of the pandemic. How bad is it? How is it transmitted? What is the mechanism? Where's it coming from? All of those issues. Is this biological warfare, or is this just a natural pandemic? All of those things and the executive would have these powers. I think then, once they vote on this, and maybe you even make it 2/3 majority to vote on this, once they give the executive those powers, I think it would have to be immediately challenged in front of the Supreme Court. So you want a non-political entity to review it and say, yes, this fits within the scope of the Constitution. In other words, to give the president of the United States, or a governor like the governor in New York, the ability to restrict people's movements should be the hardest thing in the world. It should be really difficult. They should have to make an incredibly strong case, and they would have to make it in front of the legislature, in front of the executive, and in front of the Supreme Court. All three branches of government should agree, and only then could the executive branch act. And even then, the actions would depend on the type of pandemic. In most cases, certainly in this pandemic, you wouldn't have to restrict people's liberty, because all you'd need to do is ramp up the production of testing, and most of that could be done by the private sector. You would just have to pay for it. Ramp up the tracking and isolating, which is not a violation of anybody's liberty. None of that is a violation of rights, a violation of liberty. Okay, somebody's saying, you're missing the point. The question is not whether the federal government has the power to impose lockdowns. Health questions are determined by the states. The question is whether the federal government has the authority to override states which violate constitutional liberties. Okay, that's a completely different question. So I think the federal government should have that power in a case of a national emergency. And in the case of state power, the state should have the power by the same standard. The state legislature should pass it. The executive and the state Supreme Court should have to approve it. So I think it should be unbelievably difficult. Now, should the federal government be able to override state legislatures? In egregious cases, yes. And again, they would probably have to get the legislature and the Supreme Court to buy into this. But in egregious cases, yes, they could override. And the prime example there is slavery, right? If a state institutes policies that are clearly, unequivocally a violation of individual rights, then it is the absolute function of the federal government to stop them from doing that, even to the extent of sending in troops. And that was the Civil War. That's why the Civil War happened. The South would not give up slavery, and as a consequence, a war broke out and it was a just war because the federal government could not stay silent should not have stayed silent on the question of slavery. So it can only do it if it's an egregious violation of rights, and all three branches of the government agree on that.
Oz wanted to ask a question, and I'd like to offer him the chance. Oz, can you speak up? One moment. From some reason, Oz is muted. Let's look for him.
I can unmute him. I see him. Unmute.
Yeah, go ahead. Unmute him.
Trying.
Hi, everybody. Can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Yaron, you actually answered part of the question. I wanted to ask you about the central bank as a whole, but obviously I agree that the state shouldn't say how much can I loan and how much can I vice versa. And obviously about printing money, I couldn't agree more about them doing it irresponsibly, but just wanted to ask about the alternative. What would we do if not with dollars or shekels here? How should we trade commodities?
Sure.
Your thoughts?
Sure. So first, I don't think the government should print any money responsibly or irresponsibly. So I don't believe that is a function of government. The function of government is to protect individual rights. No individual rights are at stake when it comes to money. Money should be left to banks or to anybody who wants to print money, should be able to print money. The question is, why would anybody use Oz's money, right? If you went and printed a bunch of money, why would anybody use it? Well, you would have to back it by something, right? You would have to say, you can exchange, here's the money, but you can exchange this money back for something. Now, the only way that works, and the only way that's worked in history, is with having something like the gold standard, not dictated by the government, but dictated by the marketplace. So I produce, right? In exchange for my production, let's say I get a bag of gold. I come to the bank, I come to Bank Leumi, and I put my bag of gold at Bank Leumi, and Bank Leumi gives me an IOU. It says, here's a bill for $100, and that $100 means that you get 100 ounces of gold if you hand this back to the bank. And now I can go to anybody around and give it to anybody because they have a claim on that 100 ounces of gold once they have this note, right? That's how money came into existence. That is the nature of money. Money is the money we know, the paper money, is just a bill of, it's just a bill. It's just a bill. It's like an IOU, full gold. So I don't know if it's gold or platinum or something else that the market would come up with. But the piece of paper that we consider money today should be redeemable for something real. And that something real should sit in a vault somewhere of a private business, not a government business, because the government can then manipulate it, of a government business. And you should be able to redeem that piece of paper for that, piece of gold or whatever it happens to be. So there would be Bank Leumi shekels and Bank Hapoalim shekels. And, depending on which, some of them would be worth more and some of them would be worth less, depending on the value of the bank and the riskiness of the bank, right? And then
Like
you can imagine an innovation where somebody says, you know what, we'll be a clearinghouse, we'll distribute uniform shekels, that will guarantee them, and we'll accumulate, so we'll replace Bank Leumi. And so there are all kinds of ways. It's like a clearinghouse, and the clearinghouse issues the market would evolve a way to do it efficiently, because having a million different currencies is inefficient. One of the reasons I'm pro-euro, which upsets my free market friends, because it's inefficient to have lots of currencies. So what you want, but you want the market to innovate. You don't want government to innovate. So, or innovate in quotes. So what you need is a standard unit that can be issued that is somehow guaranteed. And the market would create it. I don't know what it would look like exactly, but the market has in the past and would create it in the future. So the government would have no role. So, go ahead, Os.
Thank you. Thanks, very answered.
I don't know if you read it, Yaron, but the Israeli Freedom Movement has issued its own agenda paper. It's a roadmap of suggestions to economic recovery. It's written in Hebrew, and I think Boaz will be able to share more insight about it. And I just want to share with you some of the reforms that are listed there, like deregulation and construction in the housing market, privatizing land, partial prohibition of strikes in the public sector, pay caps and changes to the controversial pension program in Israel, transparency, privatization of government-owned companies, halt subsidies, and so on. What I wanted to ask you is that, are you sensing a change of spirit? Is there really a potential, given this pandemic and what it has done to the world and the economic crisis unfolding in so many countries, is there really a potential to promote such suggestions, such reforms?
Sure. I mean, I certainly think there's potential to promote them. I cannot be optimistic. I try.
But implementing them, yeah.
I like being optimistic. Nobody's going to take them seriously. The conclusion from this crisis is we need more government. We need bigger government. We need more intervention. They need more control over our lives, because that's the only way that we can be saved. So I wish it were true that a crisis like this opened people's eyes. But it is true that it's an opportunity to advocate for ideas that other people are not familiar with, maybe never have heard of. Maybe it's an opportunity to get a hearing where we typically don't get a hearing. So it's always good to put out working papers like that. And look, the funny thing about it is that working paper could have been written in 1979 in Israel, whenever Begin was first elected, 77, I think. It could have been written after the financial crisis. It could be written here in Puerto Rico. It's exactly the same paper that Puerto Rico needs. It's exactly the same paper that Germany needs. It's exactly the same paper Sweden needs and the United States needs and every country in the world needs. Some are a little better off, some are a little worse off, but they're all basically the same. I did a talk. I moved to Puerto Rico, in January 1, 2018. And I did a talk in March of that year. And the title of the talk here in Puerto Rico, and the title was How to Turn Puerto Rico into the Hong Kong of the Caribbean. In other words, how to solve, I don't know if you know Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico is bankrupt. It's poor. It's the poorest place in the United States. It's bankrupt. A third of government employees here work for the government. It's an economic disaster zone. And I live here in spite of that. But I gave this talk about how to turn Puerto Rico to Hong Kong of the Caribbean. And I started off my talk by saying, I can't believe I need to give this talk. All you have to do in order to become the Hong Kong of the Caribbean is do what Hong Kong did. Talk. So all you have to do is study what Hong Kong did and do it here. That's true of Israel. That's true of Sweden. That's true of every country. You want to be rich? Hong Kong on a per capita GDP is richer than America. You want to be rich? Do what Hong Kong did. Now, what did Hong Kong do? They sold, government companies. Well, they never had government companies. They basically had everything private. So in Hong Kong, in Puerto Rico, 33% of all people employed work for the government. In Hong Kong, it's less than 5%. I don't know what it is in Israel. But the first thing that struck me about limited strikes in the public sector, the first thing that struck me was, what public sector? The first reform should be no public sector, or such a small public sector that nobody cares about strikes, right? So privatize the hospitals, privatize the doctors, privatize everything. That should be, in Israel and everywhere else, that should be the number one thing to do. Move towards privatized everything, and that covers land and everything. The second thing is stop all subsidies, all subsidies. So I would have actually a basic law in Israel that says government cannot subsidize any business for any reason, right? So it doesn't take much. It's simple stuff. Cut regulations, controls, privatize, stop subsidies, and deregulate. And that's it. And then after you do all that, by the way, you can cut taxes. In America, Republicans think they're pro-liberty because they want to regulate, they want to control, they want to own everything, they want to control your life, but they want to lower your taxes. So they're so pro-freedom because they want to lower. The taxes are the last problem I have. And last problem American has. And the least problem the economy has. The biggest problem any economy has are controls, regulations, and state ownership of assets. Once you get rid of those, cutting taxes is easy.
Let's move to talking about the health system. I think what this pandemic has shown us is that there is no ideal, perfect health system around the world. I wonder what a perfect health system in your view should look like. Just this Saturday, I think there was a big protest of medical residents in Tel Aviv and Rabin Square, and this issue is often being discussed. And I think one of the conclusions from this economic crisis of this pandemic crisis is going to be that we should invest so much more in the health system, just like we do, let's say, in the security budget of Israel. And the fact is that over the last years, Israel has increased significantly its expenditure on health. And well, it doesn't mean that the system is so much better right now. So
no, it's a terrible system.
How do you tackle that?
It's a terrible system because it's socialized. You can't tackle it. There's no way. It's like public education. Everybody says, oh, we need to fix public education, government schools. How do you fix government education? More money. So California, more money. And the schools stay rotten. They don't change. Nothing happens, right? So no, the only solution to rotten government schools is not to have any. The only solution to rotten government medical care is not to have any. But it reminds me, you said that there was a demonstration of, it reminds me, my father was a doctor in the Israeli healthcare system. So I grew up with socialized medicine all around me because my father was one of the doctors. And I remember, this must have been in the 70s. I'm not sure exactly when it was. But I remember when my father went on strike. Doctors in Israel went on strike. Now, they have the Hippocratic Oath. So to go on strike, they can't really do it because if they get called, they have to go, right? They have to save the person, right? So literally, this is what happened. And this is, I don't know if anybody's written about this in Israel, but they got on buses and they went to undisclosed locations around Israel. They had no cell phones. There were no cell phones in those days. Nobody had the phone number. Nobody could call them. They just basically went off the grid. All the doctors in Israel went off the grid, basically because they wanted a pay hike from the government because they're all government employees. And just think about what an absurd state of affairs you have to have where doctors are just gone. I mean, they talk about Atlas Shrugged, right? Everybody's they're gone. There's just no healthcare. Until the government sat down and negotiated better terms for them, and they were back a few days later, with better terms. So no, there is an ideal healthcare system. It doesn't exist, unfortunately, today, but that's because there's no ideal economy today in the world. But an ideal healthcare system is one that's 100% privatized. That is one that the government has zero involvement in, zero regulation, zero taxes, zero regulation of insurance companies, It just functions like any other market. I mean, I always ask people, what do you think this would look like if a government committee designed it? And everybody laughs. They think it's really funny because they know it would be a monstrosity. It wouldn't look anything like this. And then I say, well, why then do we give that same committee healthcare, which is much more important than my iPhone? I mean, so I don't know what a private healthcare system would look like, just like I could never predict an iPhone. Markets are amazing, beautiful things, and they create the unexpected and they create great value. I think it would be significantly cheaper. I think we would live significantly longer, and I think we would be dramatically healthier. And we would have healthy relationships with our healthcare providers, that I think we would structure the healthcare system in a way that incentivized them to keep us healthy rather than just treating us when we're sick. I think insurance companies would be completely different and structured in different ways. I think every one of the problems that we have supposedly with the healthcare system, with insurance, could be solved by privatization.
Many people outside the US do believe that, hey, look at America. They have a privatized healthcare system. How do you explain it to them? I mean, I was shocked when I first moved here and I discovered on my own that it's so difficult to get a health insurance. There's only a very tiny window of 45 days per year, and then you can't get a health insurance where you want, when you want.
The policy isn't the policy you want, it's the policy you're being offered. It's the one area where we can customize what we want. Why is that? It's because the government regiments a regimented insurance policy. So in California, my wife and I tried to get a policy that didn't cover pregnancy because we're not having any more kids, too old. No such policy exists in the state of California. If you're going to buy an insurance, you have to buy acupuncture, mental health coverage. You have to buy 2,000 different things. Instead of you deciding what you want covered by an insurance policy, the government has decided what they require as a minimal for the insurance policy. So insurance is completely regulated. And then healthcare. Why does the United States have so few hospital beds? New York in particular had very few hospital beds. That's why people were really afraid of overload in the ICU. It's because in order for a hospital to expand the number of hospital beds it has, build a new wing, or just find ways to add new beds, they have to file with the government something called a certificate of need. And then a bureaucrat has to decide whether these beds are needed. Needed for whom? Needed by whom? And then the competitors of the hospital can file with the bureaucrats saying, we don't think they need the beds.
Oh my God.
So instead of the market determining how many beds are going to be there, bureaucrats decide. Instead of the market determining which drugs are available for treatments, bureaucrats decide. Instead of deciding what level of risk is acceptable for people taking a particular drug or not, markets don't decide that, individuals don't decide that, bureaucrats decide it. So in America, everything is regimented in healthcare. As you know, Tal, you can't get a price list when you go to a hospital. What services do you offer? Let me choose, or let me shop. Let me go to different hospitals and see who gives me.
You never know how much they're going to charge you. You never know in advance.
That's because of regulation, right? No business would function on the basis of treating its customers like that. No business in the world ever would do that. Only government protection allows businesses to do it like that. I had surgery on my back a few years ago. I went out and shopped, right? But I could never figure out how much the hospital was actually going to charge me. I could figure out how much a doctor would because I sat down and asked them. I could get 8 different opinions about my medical condition, but I couldn't get 8 different opinions about how much it would cost. That was taken out of my hands. It's irrelevant because doctors don't deal with money. Healthcare should be above costs, really, but everything costs money. So no, the United States does not. 60+% of every dollar spent on healthcare is spent by the government. If you're 65 and older, or if you're poor, you get socialized medicine in America. It's called Medicare or Medicaid, which dominates healthcare. So there's nothing private about American healthcare. In spite of that, in spite of the fact that it's this mixed system, it's a complete disaster, it's horrible, it's still the best healthcare system in the world. I would rather be sick in the United States, not in Puerto Rico so much, but anywhere else, than I would in Israel or in the NHS in England or in France, which supposedly has this great healthcare system. I would rather get treated in an American hospital than anywhere else. Not even close, not even close. And that's in spite of the fact that they're not anywhere near as capitalist as I think they should be or could be.
We have one more question here, a philosophical one, and we might wrap it up with this question, I think, Boaz. And Nadav is asking it. What do you think are the basic philosophical premises behind the totalitarian corona policies around the world?
Well, I mean, there are a few of them, but so let's take, I mean, one of them obviously is the idea that as individuals, we are not capable of taking care of ourselves, that we do not have the capacity to reason, to evaluate facts, to choose a path in life, and to take action based on that. And that we have to, and this is, by the way, the justification for most regulations. We have to, we have philosopher kings, we have experts, we have politicians, and they need to make decisions for us. They need to dictate our life. Our life is not, so at an epistemological level, if you will, you don't have the capacity, or a significant number of people. It's always, no, I have the capacity. It's those people over there. They don't have the capacity to think for themselves and to use reason and to evaluate the data. That's one. That's an epistemology. In ethics, it's that, you as an individual don't matter. So we need somebody who can make decisions for the society, for the group. And if we have to sacrifice you as an individual, so what? That is, the individual is not the unit of care. The unit of care, and this is both altruistic and collectivism, the unit of care is society. What is good for society? Well, let me see. Let me put out my utilitarian, algorithm, and let me try to maximize, minimize various variables. And it turns out that all people live in New York. You need to be in isolation so that we can maximize the utility for society. Right? That is how you get authoritarianism. Right? And then, ethically, even it's also the idea that we have to treat everybody the same. So we can't say I don't know any politician out there who goes on a bully pulpit and says, the people really at risk here are people over the age of 65. People over this age of 65 should be treated differently than everybody else. People over the age of 65 should be doing this. Younger people should be doing this. Other people, breaking it up. You can't do that. That's discrimination. In America, it's called ageism. You can't discriminate against old people. So we have to treat everybody the same, ignoring vast facts of reality. That's kind of egalitarianism. So all of those feed in. So, a lack of the disbelief in reason, and that reason is a capability that all individuals have, a view of society as the standard of value, which leads to collectivism, and then a view that everybody needs to treat it the same, which is egalitarianism. All of those lead ultimately to, I have the algorithm, I have the knowledge, you're too stupid, I will determine how you should behave and how you should live. I know what's best. And that's authoritarianism.
We have one more question submitted by Shai Moshe. He writes here in English, I am an accounting and economy student in a college in Israel, and so far my experience is very positive in the economy-related classes, micro and macroeconomics. I remember you once said, Yaron, in a talk when you were having a debate in Israel, that if you go to higher education, you shouldn't listen, or you should throw the books away. I'm paraphrasing it from my memory, Shai says. Sorry if I got it wrong. I was wondering if you could elaborate on the matter of higher education in regards to studying economics.
Sure. I mean, I don't know what you particularly are studying, and maybe you've got a particularly good teacher, but I don't know of a macroeconomics textbook. Maybe I know of one or two, but I don't know of any that are any good. Any. For the most part, in macroeconomics, you can take out whole chapters and shred them, because not only do they not teach you anything, they're actually teaching you falsehoods and bad stuff, right? So I'll give you one example, which I'm sure you've studied. If you have a section in your textbook, or if your professors taught you this, and they all do, about perfect competition, oligopolies and monopolies, that is, the technical word for that is crap. It is complete and utter nonsense. It's useless. Not only shouldn't you study it, since we've all studied it, you'll need to spend and exert energy to unstudy it, to get rid of it, because it's so debilitating and wrong. And it corrupts everything in economics. So once you have a chapter like that, all the other chapters are going to be bad as well, because it's going to corrupt all the other chapters. Because it's economics has this platonic ideal of perfect competition. That's the ideal. And now we have to come down to the grubby world and deal with reality as it is. But everything is now, the standard is this perfect competition model, which is complete and utter nonsense. So the whole ISM lines or the whole Keynesian stuff, it's just wrong. Now, I know it's fun to study. It kind of makes sense. The graphs, you move lines around and equations. I love equations. I love math, right? So I love equations, but equations have nothing to do with economics. In economics, there are almost no equations. Economics is mostly inductive storytelling. And yes, you can illustrate some of the ideas in equations, supply and demand curves and things like that. But you don't need more than algebra and more than a little bit of graphics to do economics. If anybody is doing calculus and they think that's economics, they don't know what economics is. And that's what most economists do. Most economists use calculus. So I've never seen a good macroeconomics class. I'm not saying there isn't one. Maybe if you want to contrast, go to Marginal Revolution University. Marginal Revolution University. It's online. It's all online. All the classes online, free. And I don't know that they are ideal, but they're better than almost everybody else I know. So go there and see how they teach macro and micro. And let me know if it's different than the way you are taught. Because I think they are probably the closest to being decent at it. I still don't think it's ideal, but they're the closest to being decent at it.
I like this answer a lot. Dr. Yaron Brook, the host of the Yaron Brook Show podcast and chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. Thank you so much for this, another fascinating, educating session. Boaz, take it away. You're muted, Boaz.
Boaz is muted.
Yeah, I'm trying to let you speak without interference from my side. So thank you everybody for participating. And we just had the honor of Jonathan Honing join us. So say hello, Jonathan. Hey.
I enjoyed the discussion, the conversation from Tal and Yaron. Boaz, thank you for facilitating it and for everyone for tuning in.
Yeah. Okay, so great. And if you see, there is a nice book behind Jonathan there, and it's available in Hebrew as well. Let's bring it in. You know,
right
I can't have.
Jonathan has it already. There you go.
Yeah, and so do I. You see, great book. So yeah, this was the fastest ever book that been translated and published in Hebrew. It took us about 3 months only, or a little bit more than that, but it was the fastest ever. And everybody in the industry should learn from Jonathan how to give rights and to produce books. So,
I think Boaz is criticizing me here.
Yeah.
Wednesday.
Yeah.
What's the next one? What's the next translation?
Right now we're working on We the Living and Philosophy Who Needs It and the Virtue of Selfishness. So We the Living will complete the whole literature, the major literature of Ayn Rand, and then we'll move with full steam to all the non-fiction. So this is our plans, and we also plan to have more events like that. So please keep in touch, everybody. If you want to say something, you know, this is the open part of the meeting, and I'll unmute everybody and we will have few minutes to make a lot of noise. You can stop the streaming, I think, that in order not to create damage. And we're closing down this event, and thank you all for participating. Stay in contact, follow us on Twitter, on Facebook, on the WhatsApp group of Zoom to Freedom, and we'll put up more events like that in the future. And thank you everybody for you.
Everybody should turn on their cameras so we can see everybody, because I think.
Yeah, please go ahead, open the cameras. You're unmuted. You're welcome to say hello.
Turn on all your.
And maybe Sophie, where are you joining from?
You're talking to me, yeah?
Yeah.
Actually, Boaz, I was a correspondent with you. I'm from FNF Jerusalem, the Friedrich Naumann Foundation.
Okay, wonderful.
Foundation, yeah. We're supposed to have a meeting with you, but we didn't manage eventually, but maybe in the future.
Yeah, we would love to have this meeting. We also supposed to have a big, large event of the Freedom Conference. And
I went once to Yaron's lecture in Ben Gurion University.
Okay.
So maybe Yaron, if you have some time, just 1 minute to answer my question.
Sure.
Go ahead. Yes.
That if it's an obligatory by the government to stay at home and not to open your business as an owner or as an employee to go to a working place, is it legit that the government should give you some support, financial support, at least the basic one to buy groceries? I mean, you hear it a lot from business owners in Israel.
The problem is this: you can't compensate for one violation of rights by doing another violation. Right? So they violated your rights by keeping you home and not allowing you to go to work. And now they want to violate your rights by taking money from some people and giving it to other people. I mean, I understand why they say that, right? Business owners want it. But you can't say because the government screwed me, I want to screw other people, which is what it is.
So somebody has their TV on, and it's really hard to hear.
I'm trying to find this guy and close it. Unless
Somebody
I
has
close everybody.
their TV on, and it's really
okay. I'll
disturbing.
mute everybody and.
Oh, it's fine.
Okay.
So I will be coming to Israel, so we can all think about planning some big events when I'm in Israel. If the world returns to semi-normal, I'm hoping to be in Israel in October. So we should, everybody who has ideas of what we should be doing, what we can do, talk to Boaz, and I've given Boaz a bunch of new work. And we can organize something. But I'm eager to do something at universities again, and do debates or do talks or whatever works in the context. But I definitely need to be in Israel sometime later this year. I was supposed to be in Israel in a week, or in a week and a few days. So I obviously delayed that, but I will be joining you in person soon.
And we just joined with Sherry Sufi. Let's see him. He's actually joining us from Australia, and he's, one moment. I don't see if you have a mic. Sherry, do you have a mic? No, only as a listener. He's a member of the Australian Liberal Party, and they had a small delegation that came and visited in Israel, and it was fun to have them here at the Ayn Rand Center and talk about the situation in Israel.
Technology makes this a global movement in ways that we couldn't have imagined I'd say even 5 years ago. You couldn't imagine how global this would become. But now it really is a completely global movement. These Zoom things can be done from anywhere to anywhere with participants from anywhere. And it's really exciting to be alive now and to have an opportunity. People constantly say, why are you investing money and doing talks outside of the United States? What the hell? What's so special, right? I mean, there's something special about America, but it's about individuals. It's not about changing a country or changing this. That we're not going to happen. What we're seeking are the best minds, the best, most motivated, most excited, most, articulate minds out there so that we can change the world. I always tell those people, Ayn Rand was an immigrant. Leonard Peikoff, for those of you who know who he was, a #1 student and the man who wrote Objectives on the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, a book everybody should read, was an immigrant. Not to put myself in their category, but I'm an immigrant. Anka, who works for me, is an immigrant. Half the people who work at the Ayn Rand Institute are immigrants. It's this notion that you should, to hell with the rest of the world. So it's always a pleasure. And I'm excited about the energy I see kind of on a global scale. I'm doing this event today, supposedly for Israel, but we got people from all over the world. I'm doing an event this weekend in the US, but there'll be people from all over the world. On Sunday, I'm doing an event for Students for Liberty in Germany. Later in the month, I'm doing an event for Students for Liberty in Italy. In between, I'm doing an event for students in Georgia, in Tbilisi and elsewhere in Georgia. I mean, all using Zoom, me never leaving the house, and people being able to, hopefully I'll be able to stream them all live to my, audiences everywhere. So we truly live in amazing times from that perspective. So as bad as things are, they're not that bad. Things are actually pretty good.
Sherry, thank you for joining us from Australia. Would you like to say something about your situation?
Sure. Thank you very much. It was just to introduce myself. I happen to be the chairman of the policy committee for the West Australian division of the Liberal Party. And I understand that we have a lot of friends here from America. Liberal in Australia means centre-right conservative. It doesn't mean what it means in Canada. So I guess, yes, as Boaz was saying, I'm one of the people that is responsible for bringing along delegations of young and old people to Israel to teach them Israeli politics, Israeli history, about Jewish civilization, and to also basically train them up to come back and be able to combat anti-Zionist propaganda, which I'm assuming, I know that people are here online here from all over the world, but in Australia, the mainstream media narrative is actually quite anti-Zionist. So I try and do my bit to give people the training, equipment and education necessary to turn them into good Zionists.
Yeah, and it was a pleasure to host your group in Israel and to have a briefing not only on the history, but also about the liberty movement in Israel, about green energy, about high-tech and so on. And we're looking forward for the next time you'll be able to visit with your friends over here. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely, we'd be looking forward to it. I mean, the only thing that's standing between us and our next trip across, I guess, is COVID-19. It's the obvious. Yeah. So it's forced us all to sort of be awake at awkward hours of the night and be using technologies like this to work away.
Yeah. Yeah, and we are thankful for the technologies, for the advancement, for all the things that make it so much easier to pass this pandemic. And so let's wrap it up now. It's the late afternoon for you, Yaron, and you know.
I've got another meeting in 5 minutes, so and it never stops.
Okay, so thank you all, and enjoy your next event, and we'll see you on our next event. Keep in touch.
Really appreciate it. Thanks, Eric, for joining us.
Bye, everybody. You may say hello. You can do like that, and it's fun. And